Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the study on implementing safeguards for climate change by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I'm your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 13th thematic consultation topic or theme so far, and this is the first in a series of 5 regional consultations and discussions on climate change. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, and also by Noelle O'Brien, Chief of the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Thematic Group. Ms. O'Brien is concurrently Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB. We also have the pleasure and privilege of being joined by Ms. Zara Abbas, Principal Environment Specialist in the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, also in the ADB. Other experts will be on hand for the question and answer session, including, excuse me, Patty Moore and Madhu Gupta. And they look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. Excuse me. Our first session on climate change is primarily with the CSOs from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. We're also joined by CSOs from North America and Europe, and the Central West region, and elsewhere in South Asia. We have a total of 10 from East Asia, 49 from Southeast Asia, and 28 from the Pacific, including 13 of those from Fiji. In this consultation, Noelle O'Brien and Zara Abbas will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on climate change in Asia and the Pacific, and the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we are hoping participants like you will share insights on the potential gaps of the provision and implementation of the 2009 policy and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming or future policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter will inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, the ADB is recording the session for the purpose of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this and the recording, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box on your screen now. We welcome you to join us from a quiet and distraction-free area, and please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand. You will then be asked to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you may ask your question live if you choose to do so. As we are all colleagues here, please be respectful to each other, and Dr. Riccardi and I will manage time to keep within our schedule. IT support is provided throughout this consultation, and you may ask for support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we are using today. As we're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen and select your preferred language. Then press the mute original audio button so you can clearly hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter. For those of you listening in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, if you feel any of your speakers are speaking too fast and you would prefer the speaker to slow down, you can ask the original speaker to slow down or speed up by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the Reactions button. When you've clicked on the Reactions button, you can then press the Slow Down button, which is the two reverse arrows pointing to your left in white, or the Speed Up button, which is the two fast forward arrows pointing to the right in blue. This will let the English speakers know to speed up or slow down accordingly. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. Click on the Rename button and type your name, the agency you represent, and any other details you wish to add, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, when invited to do so by Dr. Francesco Riccardi, click on the smile icon or the Reactions button, and then click on the Raise Hand button. Then to speak, unmute yourself and click on the microphone icon. If you wish to show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders, so let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. Just another reminder that these sessions will be recorded and documented and subsequently distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and/or distribution of the recordings, please once again contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen. If you have any issues or concerns on recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat, again through the email address at the bottom of your screen. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize our time and your time. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide welcome remarks and provide a context for this climate change study. Once again, Mr. Dunn is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, Noel O'Brien, Chief of the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Thematic Group and concurrently Director of Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department within the ADB, will provide an overview on ADB's climate change program, as well as frame the ADB's policy and strategy for climate change and safeguards. Third, Zara Abbas, Principal Environment Specialist, again within the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, will provide us with the findings of the climate change and safeguard study that has been co-authored with Patty Moore, Peter King, and others. Zara will provide us with the objectives and methodology for the analytical study on climate change and safeguards, and then go into the current coverage of climate change in the safeguards policy statement. Zara will then discuss the benchmarking findings on safeguards and climate change and offer areas for further consideration and next steps. After the third presentation by Zara Abbas, we will have a brief 5-minute break. And when we resume, we will be joined for the moderated discussion on the topic of implementing climate change safeguards in Asia and the Pacific, facilitated by Dr. Francesco Riccardi, an environment specialist within the Safeguards Division, again, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. This will be a Q&A session that runs for about 70 minutes. Here, you may ask questions and share experiences in the chat box or through raising your hand using the Zoom features as I explained previously. A reminder that you may ask your questions in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese in the chat box, or through raising your hand as previously explained in the Zoom functions. Dr. Riccardi will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversation. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and the next steps following the consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and contextual overview of the climate change study. Bruce?
Thank you very much, Azim. Good day, welcome, and thank you very much for joining this regional consultation with civil society on climate change and safeguards. This session is being organised as part of the review and update of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short. Really pleased today to see so many of you joining. I think we have already about 90 people on the call, which is great. As many of you have joined previous stakeholder consultations, let me welcome you back. And I want to thank you very much for your continued engagement in this process. And of course, for those of you that are joining for the first time, we might very much welcome your participation as well. And I do think that with today's topic on climate change, we'll have a very interesting discussion. Now, to start this session, I'd like to provide just some very brief background on the process to update the Safeguard Policy Statement, particularly for some of the new participants that may not have joined previous sessions. Firstly, ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, or IED, completed an evaluation on the existing Safeguard Policy Statement in May 2020. ADB management then endorsed all of the main recommendations in the report and then launched the process to update the policy. The update process is expected to be completed by about March 2023, so that's over about a 2.5-year period, although we may need to extend the period if we require more time to undertake additional stakeholder consultations. Now, the process to update the policy started firstly with the development of a background, what you might also call an approach paper, followed by a stakeholder engagement plan, and then some initial consultations around that. And you can find these documents available on ADB's website. We've then gone into a process to prepare a series of background studies on various different thematic topics, which have been prepared, made publicly available, and then we've discussed them through a series of regional consultations. We've so far completed, I think, 13 topics with consultations held with ADB's developing member countries, or DMCs, you might hear us refer to it during the consultation. So with DMCs, civil society organizations, as well as ADB private sector clients. Plus, we're doing quite a bit of consultations with other multilateral financial organizations, or MFIs. And so far, most of the consultations have focused on what I might call some of the core areas in the current policy related to environment, to involuntary settlement, and to Indigenous peoples safeguards. But we're now moving into more of a final stage in some of these technical studies where we're getting into a range of more cross-cutting issues, including climate change today. And also over the next few weeks, we'll be looking closely at a range of gender issues. We'll have a series of 3 linked consultations on gender and safeguards, on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment issues, and then on sexual orientation and gender identity issues. You can find, we'll be providing the link to these upcoming consultations in the chat. But with these more broader issues, many of them are actually covered by other long-term strategies and approaches within ADB, forward-looking agendas that seek to address concerns, say, around climate change and gender as proactive development issues. So while we may be discussing some elements related to safeguards, there are wider long-term agendas within the ADB that are very important for us to also consider and understand in these consultations. Now, for today, of course, we will be focused on climate change, arguably one of the most important challenges facing the world today. And many of you will have noted, as we have, with quite some concern about the findings that were included in the latest International Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment reports, the various installments of that last year and this year, which certainly again reinforce the critical changes that are happening in the world and the accelerated pace of change. Now, given the significance of climate change issues, ADB has included tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability as one of the 7 operational priorities under ADB Strategy 2030. And as part of this, we've increased our climate finance ambition to $100 billion by 2030 from 2019 cumulatively. And we've committed to fully align ADB operations with the Paris Agreement. And you'll hear more about this today during the upcoming presentation by the Chief of ADB's Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Thematic Group, Ms. Noelle O'Brien. And then for safeguards, there are already some aspects of climate change in the current policy. These are focused largely on the assessment and management of greenhouse gas emissions. However, these requirements are now more than a decade old and clearly do need to be reviewed given the current understanding of climate change and current commitments by ADB and of course by the world community. And the safeguards do not currently cover climate change risk assessment, or not clearly anyway. However, outside of safeguards, ADB does undertake climate risk assessment for all of our projects, and we provide support for our developing member countries to assess climate risks and to develop measures to support adaptation and resilience to climate change. So there are elements that are within the safeguard policy, but there are also elements that are outside of the policy, but do have some relationship, obviously, to issues considered on safeguards. Now, as you'll see in the upcoming presentations, there are a number of questions that we need to consider about how to appropriately include safeguards in the new policy, but also how to distinguish some of the linked areas with ADB's strategic support and financing to our developing member countries and clients. So I think this consultation is going to be one where, of course, we're discussing both the strategic agenda of ADB on climate change, as well as the safeguards. But importantly, what we're working towards through this consultation program is to consider what should be within the remit of safeguards. And of course, how does that relate to the wider issues and programs? And then within the safeguards, we also need to consider how do climate change issues link to a range of other issues. Of course, it starts with the assessment of environmental and social issues and risks, but of course the linkages between areas such as gender and vulnerable groups, community health and safety, pollution prevention, biodiversity, resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards, just to name a few, are obviously all very critical with an issue like climate change. So those cross-cutting dimensions in the policy will also be very important for us to consider. Now, for today, we're here with this regional consultation in listening mode. We're keen to listen to your views and to your recommendations. And of course, we'll be providing during the moderated session some initial brief responses to your questions and recommendations. But again, I do have to thank you for joining today. We're looking forward to an interesting and dynamic session. And with that as opening remarks, let me now hand over to the Chief of our climate change team, Ms. Noelle O'Brien. Over to you, Noelle. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Bruce. Can I just confirm that sound is okay? I've just
all clear, Noelle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. Good morning, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here as part of the consultation on ADB's new safeguard policy. I want to talk to you today briefly about the range of initiatives that ADB is involved in and our overarching climate change strategy. So let's move to the next slide, please. I'm just going to talk through ADB's strategies and policies, approach for climate and disaster resilience, and then also some of our recent initiatives. Over to the next slide, please. So let's take a look at the chronology of addressing climate change in ADB. Starting in the 1980s and 1990s, where climate change solutions were being integrated into ADB's wider work. In 2010, then we had the broad paper on addressing climate change in Asia and the Pacific with priorities for action. This was followed in 2014 with the reiteration of those commitments in the midterm review of ADB's Strategy 2020. In 2015, ADB committed to double climate finance from ADB's own resources from 3 billion in 2014 to 6 billion in 2020. Then in 2017, ADB developed the Climate Change Operational Framework 2017 to 2030. In 2018, as part of the new ADB Strategy 2030, Operational Priority 3 focuses on climate change, and I'll talk through that in the next slide. In 2019, ADB committed to fully align sovereign operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement by 2023 and 25 for non-sovereign operations. And then in 2021, we had the announcement to raise the ambition of climate finance to 100 billion between the years 2019 to 2030. So you can see the remarkable shift between 2015 and 2021 from that 6 billion commitment to the now 100 billion commitment over the period up to 2030. Also in 2021, we had the revised disaster and emergency assistance policy and also ADB's new energy policy. So a lot going on. Thank you, and over to the next slide. Now, in terms of Strategy 2030, as I indicated, operational priority 3 focuses on tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability. The 3 priority areas are specifically the mitigation of climate change being increased, climate and disaster resilience built, and an environmental sustainability enhanced. As you can see from the schematic here, I'll just touch on the operational approaches that were set out, and then the sub-pillars that are part of the focus. So these include the access to finance being increased, the capacity development of member countries being enhanced, low carbon infrastructure improved, also areas such as planning for climate change, adaptation and disaster risk management being improved. And so those are all parts of the sub-pillars. Now, as part of the 2030 commitment in Strategy 2030, ADB set out the target of 75% of our operations incorporating climate change. And we set the target of 80 billion of ADB's own resources being addressed to climate change by the year 2030. And then in 2021, we raised the level of ambition to 100 billion by 2030, and also the consideration that ADB would align all of ADB's sovereign activities with Paris Agreement by the 1st of July 2023. 85% of non-sovereign operations would be aligned by the 1st of July 2023 also, and with full alignment of non-sovereign operations by the 1st of July 2025. So thank you, and over to the next slide. Now, for ADB's President's planning directions, ADB will prioritize three key operational directions. This balancing COVID-19 response with support for a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. And as part of that, we specifically state that supporting a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery, ADB will mainstream climate and disaster resilience into its support for sectors and themes that have suffered in the current pandemic. So over to the next slide. Now, just touching on ADB's climate finance commitments from 2017 to 2021, you can see clearly the kind of finance that we are, our climate finance figures for 2019, we had achieved a total of 7 billion, and in 2021, that figure dropped to 4.8 billion, but we are focused on raising those numbers again in 2022 and onwards through to achieve that ambition of 100 billion by 2030. Let's move to the next slide. Now, in terms of ADB's commitment to aligning operations to the Paris Agreement. So as I've indicated, we've set July 1, 2023 for 100% of the sovereign operations and not 85% of non-sovereign operations. Now, we are working with the agreed MTB methodology as part the process for ADB's alignment. This methodology sets out 6 building blocks, which are BB1, alignment with mitigation goals of the Paris Agreement, BB2, adaptation and climate resilient operations. Then for building block 3, it's accelerated contribution to the transition through climate finance. In BBB4, strategy, engagement, and policy development with, I'm sorry, just one second. I need some water, I'm sorry. Building block 4 focuses on reporting, and building block 6 focuses on aligning internal activities, so ADB's own footprint of engagement. So ADB is currently developing the overarching methodology for aligning our operations and also specific sector guidance for each of our major sectors. And this is nearing completion for application in Q3 2022. Over to the next slide, please. Now, in terms of, I mentioned earlier, we had the revised disaster and emergency assistance policy from 2021. So our engagement in disaster risk management is guided by the 2021 revised disaster and emergency assistance policy. And this is based on 4 principles. Risk management begins with risk reduction. Disaster and emergency risk management is an integral part of the development process. ADB's developing member countries have differentiated risk profiles and thus differentiated opportunities for enhanced resilience. And the 4th principle, that timely, carefully planned and well-designed relief, early recovery, and reconstruction interventions and solutions reduce the near and long-term social, institutional, and economic impacts of disasters and emergencies and facilitate resilient recovery. Over to the next slide. Now, in terms of ADB's approach for climate and disaster resilience, ADB sets out a comprehensive approach for resilience. Covering ecological resilience, physical resilience, financial resilience, social and institutional resilience. And that involves advancing different aspects of resilience through our cross-sectoral investments, beyond infrastructure, also in the social, environment, and social sectors. Our intent is to build system-wide resilience through projects that recognize the independency of critical infrastructure. And we're also focusing on investments that bring transformational change through resilience, such as risk-informed land use planning to inform the selection and location of infrastructure projects. Over to the next slide. Now, in terms of our strategies for scaling up climate adaptation and resilience, we are focusing on 3 approaches: strengthening upstream engagement with our DMCs on adaptation. We're focusing on scaling up adaptation projects, focusing on the outcomes, and also expanding adaptation in the non-infrastructure projects. So in terms of what do we mean by upstream engagement with the DMCs? This is support to our member countries in national adaptation planning. Also, we do support for undertaking what we call multi-hazard disaster and climate assessments that inform pipeline. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more on this, we have one of our multi-hazard assessments in the main island of Tonga Tapu in Tonga, which is already available on ADB's website. We have a number of other assessments in the pipeline. We also have support for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. ADB is currently in the process of undertaking the first report, which will be published later in 2022. Now, in terms of scaling up adaptation projects where we have a focus on outcomes, we're supporting our DMCs in developing and financing adaptation projects in the infrastructure sectors. Also, we're supporting strengthening support for private sector engagement in agribusiness for resilience, but also strengthening the linkage between adaptation and nature positive investments. And I also mentioned the support for adaptation in non-infrastructure sectors. So here we're scaling up adaptation efforts in our education, health, and social sectors. Also, climate smart agriculture and food security, and supporting adaptation related reforms through ADB's work on policy-based lending. And then one example of a new initiative is we have a new program on community resilience to help scale up local investments in climate change. And this program has very strong focus on the nexus between climate, gender, and poverty. Over to the next slide. Now, in terms of, Bruce has already mentioned that ADB conducts climate risk assessments on each of our investments. So in 2014, ADB institutionalized the climate risk management framework to assess the climate risk of projects at the early stage of development. Every project undergoes a climate risk screening, and projects that are screened as medium or high risk have to undertake a climate risk and adaptation assessment during the project preparation phase to inform the project design. And results of the screening and assessment are documented and disclosed in project documents, in the report and recommendations of the President, and the link document. And you can see through the schematic the kind of process that ADB works through for the climate risk assessment. Over to the next slide. Now, ADB has also the commitment to as delivering Paris alignment, as I've already mentioned. We are strengthening our support to upstream climate developments, and we have a couple of technical assistance projects. One is supporting NDC Advance. Here, through this technical assistant, we support our DMCs to mobilize finance, develop policies and plans, and build capacity to implement and monitor their nationally determined contributions. As part of this process, we include the links between the NDCs and ADB's operations at the country partnership strategy level and also at the project level. We have included a new stream of work on linking private sector finance to the NDCs, and within this process, we have various initiatives, where some of which are focused on sector-specific implementation of NDCs. In other cases, it is building investment projects for NDC implementation. A second initiative in this area is support to long-term strategies. Long-term strategies promote the whole of economy transformation towards low greenhouse gas and resilient economies, and consider the broader sustainability and socioeconomic goals. And so this is an area where we are growing our support. And the third focus that I'll mention with this slide is our work on just transition. Now, just transition focuses on the impact on people of climate change, recognizing that the scale of the transition needed and ensuring no one is left behind. Just transition entails multi-sector, multi-stakeholder participation, and understanding the country-specific context and constraints. This work within ADB, we're working to set up a just transition platform. We're also undertaking a number of assessments in relation to sector-specific considerations for just transition, but also a key agenda will be institutional support for our DMCs on the whole requirements of just transition. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. I'll be very happy to take further questions and provide more detail on any of those. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Noel. That was a very comprehensive overview of ADB's operational level climate change program. As you can all see, that it has several components, and they are undertaken at various times in the overall project life cycle. So I'll carry this discussion forward to show how ADB and its comparator MFIs are providing climate change coverage through the safeguards window. So for this, we undertook an analytical study that looks at climate change coverage from the angle of safeguards. And I'll briefly discuss the findings here. There will be some reference to what Noel has discussed, but as Anna Pauline just put it in the chat window here. The presentation was shared earlier, and it's also, you can download it, and you can go back to look at the details, because the presentation that Noel just delivered has a lot of very useful information, and you might find it useful to go back and see that. So before I go into this, I'll walk you through how we undertook the study. I'll present a brief background, starting with the objectives and how the existing ADB Safeguards Policy Statement, SPS, covers climate change, the findings of the comparative analysis, and some possible next steps. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We'll briefly start by discussing the methodology that was adopted for the study. It largely follows the approach that we have been taking for the other analytical studies that we have been sharing with you for over the past few months, and most of you have been participating in our other consultations as well. So you may be a little bit familiar with the process. So the first step was to review ADB's current safeguards policy framework from the perspective of climate change, and also review other non-safeguard strategies, plans, programs that ADB has with regards to climate change. And that was what was just explained in the previous session by Noel as ADB's broader climate change agenda. Then we undertook a comparison of the extent of climate change related coverage provided by other MFIs through their safeguards frameworks, and also broadly through other avenues that are not currently covered in the existing MFI safeguards policies. This was a desk review and compared how the SPS and its associated and the ADB associated documents for climate change compare with the selected MFI safeguards policies and their related documents on climate change. And the areas that it covered was climate change mitigation and adaptation, and also other subtopics within this area. Now, for the purpose of the comparative analysis, in addition to looking at the ADB SPS, the other MFIs studied include the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, European Investment Bank, International Finance Corporation, Inter-American Development Bank, the New Development Bank, and the World Bank. Since climate change has many emerging aspects and it's a rapidly changing arena, we wanted to go beyond our major comparator MFIs that we had been looking at in the other studies, and which you've been seeing over the past months. And those were basically the World Bank, AIIB, Inter-American Development Bank, IFC, and EBRD. So we went beyond that. They have similar policies and also have similar business models to ADB, and have also recently upgraded their safeguards frameworks. So in this study, we also have considered some bilateral programs, such as the Millennium Challenge Corporation and also the Green Climate Fund. Next slide, please. So I will not go into the details of ADB's operational level climate change program, because that was just presented by Noel. But if you go to the very beginning of her slide deck, there is a chronology of dates, and I'll just sort of mention it a little bit to give some perspective to my discussion. So ADB has been addressing climate change, as was just explained, since the early 1980s. And then starting with the Climate Prioritized Action Plan in 2010, then an operational framework on climate change in 2017, and then in 2018 as a specific operational priority area under ADB Strategy 2030, and now in 2020 2021, ADB has committed to be fully aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The details are all just presented. So how is this greater agenda being implemented? So this is being done through portfolio level alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement, project level greenhouse gas emissions assessment and management, and project level climate risk screening and climate risk and adaptation assessment. So what we have seen, what we have since 2009, the project level climate change mitigation has been addressed through the safeguards policy under environmental safeguards. So these safeguards requirements, one, which is environmental safeguards, contain 11 policy principles. These cover environmental screening, assessment, management, and monitoring. And there are also specific policy principles that focus on biodiversity, pollution prevention, community health and safety, cultural heritage, etc. So when we look at the safeguards policy, the current safeguards policy, policy principle 2 covers climate change through the assessment process, the environmental assessment process. And policy principle 9 addresses the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions. And other than that, we also see implications of managing climate change impacts in the safeguards policy provisions that cover community health and safety, where the SPS requires avoiding or minimizing the exacerbation of natural hazards, and where these could affect communities. And we know that climate change is one of the driving reasons behind the increased frequency and severity of certain natural hazards. So there's the linkage there. Next slide, please. So a little bit detail on the policy principles that are provided in the safeguards policy. So policy principle 2 spells out the requirements for environmental assessment, and it requires assessing a project's potential direct, indirect, cumulative, and induced impacts and risks to the environment. And it must also address potential transboundary and global impacts, including climate change. So this is mentioned in the policy principle. While when we look at policy principle 9 on pollution prevention, it specifically requires the borrower to promote the reduction of project-related greenhouse gas emissions appropriate to the nature of the project and the scale of the project and its impacts. At the project, right from the project preparation stage, for projects that produce significant quantities of greenhouse gases, the borrower is required to quantify direct emissions of greenhouse gases as if they are above 100,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and also evaluate project design options to reduce or offset the project-related greenhouse gas emissions during the operation stage. Next slide, please. So here, now we get into the benchmarking study or the comparative analysis on how climate change is covered by other MFIs. So this analysis compared ADB's overall approach to climate change with the safeguard policies or frameworks of other ADB comparators. Comparator MFIs, and as I just said, this is AIIB, EBRD, EIB, IFC, Inter-American IDB, NDB, New Development Bank, and the World Bank. So it was seen that only the European Investment Bank, EIB, has a standalone standard on climate change in its safeguards framework. All others reference climate change in various manners and with varying degree of detail, either in their overarching policy statement through safeguard standards or standalone climate change action plans or strategies. So there are various manners in which this coverage is provided. So the comparative analysis or benchmarking was undertaken across a series of subtopics under the overall topic of climate change. So this includes mitigation, adaptation, climate risk assessment, low carbon development, biodiversity and ecosystem services. And however, since climate is cross-cutting, there is a great variation amongst MFIs as to which standards have provisions with regards to the subtopic under climate change. So I'll now go to these subtopics and the broad areas. So the first here, as you can see on the slide, is mitigation. All comparator MFIs that were studied make reference to climate change mitigation and this can be at the level of the core principles of their policies or frameworks, vision statement or overall policy statement. At the level of the standards, generally the MFIs studied address climate change mitigation measures in their standards on environmental and social impact and risk assessment. They also specify reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So most of them also highlight low carbon development as a mitigation option, and some also explicitly include renewable energy as a mitigation option. And as far as significance thresholds, it's seen that for greenhouse gas emissions, these vary quite widely, mainly since standards have been updated recently and it's a rapidly developing area. ADB is seen to have a threshold which is quite low, as 100,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. EIB is at 20,000, while EBRD requires quantifying greenhouse gas emissions if a project emits more than 100,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, or if it creates a net positive or negative change in emissions of more than 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Next slide, we'll go into the other areas. So with regards to adaptation, all comparator MFIs have provisions on climate change adaptation in their safeguard standards. And most, about 5 of them, also have substantive provisions on resilience to the impacts of climate change. Provisions on adaptation include considering adaptation opportunities and the risks and impacts identification process. And this is essentially IFC, NDB, World Bank, and AIIB. While now EBRD, World Bank, and IDB require identifying appropriate adaptation measures to be integrated into project design, construction, and operation. So all MFI safeguards frameworks have requirements related to climate change impacts on biodiversity and or ecosystem services, but they address these across different standards, mostly identifying climate change impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems in the assessment process, the environmental assessment process. Some MFIs refer specifically to impacts on ecosystem services that may be exacerbated by climate change, while others require assessment of potential climate change impacts on biodiversity in a more general manner. And similarly, all MFIs have resilience requirements. World Bank and AIIB address it in their environmental and social impact and risk assessment standards, while others cover these in other standards. So NDB, New Development Bank, EIB, the European Investment Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank include substantive requirements in their standards to address double materiality which means assessing the impacts of a project on climate change as well as that of climate change on the project. And climate risk assessment, EBRD, EIB, and Inter-American Development Bank have clear requirements to undertake climate risk assessments. Next slide, please. So other topics such as sequestration and transitions, EIB is the only MFI that has requirements in its standards for documenting a project's carbon sequestration as well as its emissions and for reporting on transition risks. So NDB and AIIB mention climate proofing investments or infrastructure at the level of their core principles at a higher level or vision statement, but do not have substantive requirements in their standards. And alignment with the Paris Agreement in upstream planning is, when we look at it, most MFIs have committed to full alignment with the Paris Agreement over the next 2 to 3 years. We've just been as informed as Noel just explained that ADB has made significant progress in committing to align in its operations to the Paris Agreement. And staff guidance is under preparation for this. So similar to ADB, all MFIs consider climate change in their upstream country planning and institutional strengthening work. For example, EIB uses advisory services to ensure alignment, and the Green Climate Fund encourages country program and an accredited entity program to ensure that all pipeline projects have potential to meet their investment criteria. So here, and as Noel just explained, for ADB has an upstream process through the climate change program on how to engage with at an earlier stage. So most MFIs have prohibited investment lists or exclusion lists that identify types of projects that that particular MFI will not finance, or positive lists of activities that are encouraged for financing. Only EBRD and IDB in their safeguard standards exclude financing initiatives that contribute to climate change risks and impacts. And for EBRD and IDB, these are coal mining, coal-fired power generation, oil and gas exploration and development, and or exploration. Now, the safeguards policy, ADB safeguards policy, the current one, has an annex for prohibited investment activities, which lists activities that do not qualify for ADB financing. But this list doesn't specifically have activities that have climate change repercussions, with just one exception, and that is that there is a prohibition on financing commercial logging operations or for the purchase of logging equipment which could be used in primary tropical moist forests or old growth forests. But recently, as also Noel explained, the ADB just approved the energy policy, and the energy policy has prohibitions that are linked to climate change, or rather have climate change related prohibitions. It lists areas that ADB will not support, including coal, mining and processing and storage, transportation of coal, new coal-fired power and heating plants, and also natural gas exploration or drilling activities, or any oil and gas exploration activity or extractive activity. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the benchmarking study showed that most of the comparator MFIs do have provisions in their safeguard standards for climate change. The provisions differ and provide varying degree of details on mitigation, adaptation, resilience, climate change impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services, low carbon development, climate risk assessment, and also on double materiality. They also have upstream commitments, which is outside of their safeguards frameworks. So these issues that I've just mentioned could be issues that for ADB to consider as part of the update, keeping in mind how this can integrate with ADB's overall climate change program that was just explained by Noel, and it's very comprehensive, detailed program. So as to achieve the most effective outcomes. So this will require further analysis of options, of course, internal discussions, and most importantly, inputs from stakeholders such as yourselves. And this discussion should be one point where we can enter. And the policy update will review, in addition to policy provisions, internal mechanisms for coordinating climate risk assessments to enhance their integration into the overall project risk and impact assessment process. In addition to that, also review the use of double materiality and the current threshold for project level greenhouse gas emissions. So these are some of the areas. Then in addition, there's also a need to consider strengthening existing procedures and mechanisms for portfolio level greenhouse gas accounting and linking project level monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions to upstream work, such as the country partnership strategies, and the implementation plans for the DMC's nationally determined contributions. So I will stop here and hand it over to Azim, and he will then take the discussion forward, and we'll have lead you into more of a discussion session after this. So I hope that the context provided will help frame the discussion along with Noel's very comprehensive background. And again, the presentation is available to be downloaded so that you can refer to the details there. Thank you so much. Azim.
Thank you so much, Noel and Zara, for your very comprehensive and detailed presentations and the wonderful overviews provided. These presentations, and as Zara said, they're available through the link. You can download them, offer us the clarity and some of the unique challenges and processes related to implementing climate change safeguards in Asia and the Pacific. And in particular on elaborating the policy principle 2 on environmental assessment, as well as on policy principle 9 on pollution prevention, as well as the concepts of, for example, double materiality and carbon offsets, as well as some of the other issues and considerations that were raised in Zara's presentation. And as mentioned, we hope we can get to feedback and provide an opportunity to delve into some of these issues during the discussions arising from the Q&A session. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. We hope we can get further feedback from you on what the ADB should consider in these general policy topics and areas during the facilitated Q&A session. This session will run for about 75 minutes, but there is some flexibility in that. And just a note that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select send a message with your question, comment, or other contribution to either Jennifer de Belen or Gelson Garcia, who are members of the team working behind the scenes, and they will then repost your question to protect your identity and ensure you have anonymity. Let's now then pause for a 5-minute break. Before we do, can I please invite you to think about a poll evaluation question that we will have later on. But if you wish to register your written feedback now on how to improve these consultations, how to engage with us better, how to have your voices heard, the link to the menti.com questionnaire is posted in the chat box now. So before you get your tea, coffee, or other favorite drink, just a heads up on some guide questions that are being flashed on the screen now that we'd like you to think about through and give your feedback on when we resume with the Q&A session moderated by Dr. Francesco Riccardi. So with that, you will see a timer at the top right-hand side of your screen that says 5 minutes. When that countdown timer reaches 0, you will know that it's time to return to your screens as we're about to resume the consultation. There will also be some background music being played, and as that background music fades away, it will also be an indication to return to your screen. So with that, we will leave the guide questions for discussion that Dr. Riccardi will take us through after the break on the screen, and we will invite you back to join us after a 5-minute stretch break. See you all very soon. Thank you very much and welcome back, everybody. We will now have an open and facilitated discussion as moderated by Dr. Francesco Riccardi, an environment specialist within the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. A reminder that you can ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And that Dr. Riccardi will take questions in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. A further reminder that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send a message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select or send a message either to Jennifer DeBellin or Gelson Garcia, who are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question anonymously to protect your identity. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and offer next steps following the consultation. So with that, let's start without any further delay. Dr. Riccardi, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Azim, and thank you very much, everyone, to be here today for this session. I first of all apologize for my face and for my voice. It's 5 a.m. in the morning here. So I'll probably not be very sharp, but at least at the very beginning, I'll try to pick it up in a bit. But anyway, I'd really like to have today a discussion with all of you, and I hope it's going to be constructive for everyone. So we already have some questions and already also one hand up. Let me start with some of the questions that we received before the call. And the very first one is possible for you, Ms. Lisa Sprout, if you are there, if you want to give us the question live, I would like to hand it over to you. But are you there, and would you like to intervene? Okay, I don't hear from Lisa yet. I can go ahead. The question is from Lisa Sprout, is a policy campaigner of the Friends of the Earth in the US. This is related to biodiversity loss and biodiversity offset. So I think it's very important that they also consider that climate change is not a simple issue; it's a cross-cutting issue and covering various aspects, including biodiversity. Can I invite, please, Bruce Dunn, maybe to take this question first, and then let's see if any other people want to intervene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And again, thank you to everyone for joining. We're looking forward to this discussion session. So I appreciate, firstly, the question from Lisa Sprout from Friends of the Earth. This question relates to biodiversity issues, but of course, there's a close relationship with biodiversity loss and climate change issues, clearly in terms of carbon, but also climate risk issues. So it's a very relevant issue. Firstly, I just want to say at the strategic level, ADB has committed to addressing biodiversity loss and also scaling up investments in natural capital. We have that as part of our strategy 2030. Some of you may have also seen commitments made recently through the recent climate change COP of multilateral development banks around biodiversity issues. So that is, of course, feeding into and framing some of the considerations for the update of biodiversity aspects in the safeguard policy. We've appreciated the study and recommendations from Friends of the Earth around banks and biodiversity issues, which specifically look at no-go policy. There is a recommendation there to strengthen or somewhat move beyond the existing mitigation hierarchy approach to have greater clarity in terms of no-go areas. And there's certainly some key recommendations there that we can certainly support, and we've been looking closely at. In fact, our team leading the biodiversity study have been reviewing that paper and recommendations. There's a couple of things that I'd just like to mention specifically and briefly to start with, and then we can come back to other issues later. Firstly, a big challenge with the mitigation hierarchy is it promotes avoidance, but often projects come in at a late stage where opportunities for avoidance may have already been foregone. This is something we're looking at in the safeguard policy. How do you strengthen that approach? Obviously, you need upstream strategic planning on biodiversity. You need robust alternatives assessment to address biodiversity loss. It can't just be done at a project level only. As part of that, we need to strengthen across a whole range of aspects in relation to biodiversity issues. Just to name a few, we certainly need to improve the baseline data collection, the assessment of important habitats, including critical habitats. We need to strengthen protection for protected and internationally recognized areas. We need to look at ecosystem services. So in all of those areas, I'll mention a couple of things that we're thinking about. One is we believe that we do need to go beyond a framework that only considers no net loss of biodiversity. Obviously, avoidance, as I've said, or going for net gains in biodiversity is critical. The criteria for critical habitats needs to be improved, and we think there's some areas that may need to be added to that. For example, we're considering to add free-flowing rivers as part of the framework. That was one of the recommendations that had come through from Friends of the Earth and others. We're also looking at provisions for possibly including some no-go areas, the ones that we think are potentially highly relevant and practical and feasible would be around natural World Heritage sites and potentially Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. In considering any no-go, we need to make sure that you've got clearly defined criteria, scientific basis for determining those areas. There has to be something that you can apply without necessarily saying, you know, that large swathes of areas without defined criteria would not be available for development. So we need to focus in on the criteria. And then lastly, I'll just mention biodiversity offsets. This was something we discussed a lot in the biodiversity consultations. Offsets clearly have weaknesses, are not achieving the results that we'd like to get. We have observations of this from ADB's work, but I think this is the findings in the literature. So we're looking at clarity in terms of when offsets could be used and when they can't. Clearly for important critical habitats, offsets are not something we think is the way to go. But in other areas, it may be necessary to retain strengthened offset frameworks. So I'll stop there, Francesco. That's a lot, there's a whole consultation in that topic, but there may be other follow-up questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce. Indeed, it was a very long discussion in all the biodiversity consultation we had. I think if you are interested, you can find a transcript and a record of the previous presentation on the ADB update, SPS update page, if you are interested. I noticed that we have Catherine, which is coming from the same group of Friends of the Heart. Maybe she wants to pick up from Lisa's question and add further details. Thank you. Over to you, Catherine.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you, Bruce, for that really thorough response. I'm really glad to hear that the no-go areas are something that the bank is considering. And so one of the follow-up questions that I wanted to ask in listening to the presentation today is that obviously climate change and biodiversity are inherently interdependent and interlinked. And one of the things that caught my eye in the analytical study that was published by the ADB is the increased attention on greenhouse gas accounting across the bank's portfolio, which I think is a really good direction. At the same time, I would really look forward to seeing more about how that greenhouse gas accounting methodology unfolds. And one of the other things that came to my mind as well in looking at that was wondering how the bank will harmonize both biodiversity and climate goals in both their safeguards and in their commitments, so as to preempt potential conflicts and contradictions between their climate approaches and their biodiversity approaches. So, for instance, according to the analytical study on climate change, it says that clients will need to evaluate options to reduce or offset greenhouse gas emissions. And so it was not clear exactly how the bank intends to use offsetting, whether biodiversity offsets or carbon offsets, as a means in their either biodiversity or climate change commitments, which I think is something that could possibly or should definitely actually be looked into more and perhaps expanded, because given the very narrow time window of being able to stay within the 1.5 degree scenario, it doesn't seem as if any offset measures are compatible if we are to stay within that 1.5 degree timetable at this point. And of course, you know, both carbon and biodiversity offsets are well known and well associated with really harmful negative biodiversity and climate impacts, and may in fact, you know, provide the illusion of progress when in fact it is having the opposite effect. And so, so my question, is really, how does the bank intend to harmonize both climate and biodiversity commitments, because they are so deeply interwoven? And how will the bank use not only sectoral exclusions, which I think was also mentioned in the climate change note as well. The bank has exclusions on coal and has some exclusions in other areas, but it also seems as if another area for consideration, like Bruce mentioned, for area-based or ecosystems exclusion. So just really curious sort of how the bank plans to harmonize both its climate and biodiversity targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the clarification and additional question. I don't know, Bruce, do you want to pick up the question, or I can pass to someone else?
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you, Francesco. I was going to propose it might be useful to first hear a little bit more from our colleagues on the climate change team about the approach and methodology for greenhouse gas assessment at the portfolio level. And then after that, we can come and speak a little bit more on the safeguard side, including the relationships between the climate assessment and biodiversity.
Sure, Bruce, thank you for the suggestion. So can I hand over to Noelle if she wants to answer about this first part? I'm not sure Noelle is still online.
Apologies, I am here. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
It is. It's 4:15 in the morning here, so it's just my computer is responding slowly. Let me. So let's take a number of levels at which ADB is obviously considering greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, the first point that I've brought up is the fact that we are committed to fully aligning our operations with the Paris Agreement from July 2023. So this means all of ADB's projects will be assessed for alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So I think that is a major step forward in addition to our current commitments. In terms of the question of offsetting in relation to biodiversity, Bruce, I'm going to ask you to pick that up, and actually VK is here online. That's what I was just going to check. So VK is going to come in with that question. Over to you, VK.
Thank you very much, Noelle, and thanks for a very interesting question. Yeah, so Zara alluded to what we have done in terms of assessment and what we are planning to do in terms of GHG accounting and reporting. A bit of additional information from my side is that ADB is currently preparing institutional guidelines for assessing and reporting the carbon footprint of its entire project portfolio. So a bit of a disclaimer, it's work in process. But we want to roll it out as soon as possible. So the overall idea is to ensure that we have a transparent and consistent carbon footprint approach bank-wide. And in terms of the approach that we want to take, we want to assess all projects in all sectors supported by ADB through loans and grants. Of course, we are looking at some exclusions for the projects that are supported by ADB. For example, the projects that will have absolute or relative emissions, positive or negative, in excess of 20K equivalent of CO2, and the projects which are indirectly financed by ADB or under any policy-based lending, for which it could be a little more challenging to assess and report the carbon footprint. And that would also include the projects like technical assistance projects and transaction advisory services operations that we support. Now, there could be additional projects that could be included for exclusions, but generally speaking, the idea is to widen the net as far as possible. So what we want to do is to assess each project for its relative emissions at the project level, disclose it, and then do the comparative assessment of the entire project portfolio and disclose it at the year end. Just to set the context, ADB is also a part of the IFI working group on GHG accounting, and the guidelines that we are developing are in sync with the latest discussions that we are having at the IFI working group. So this is an important piece of work that we have been looking at different options, whether to report the GHG emission reductions, which we are doing regardless as a part of our development effectiveness report. But since we want to report on the wider scale so that we have a metric and reporting on the entire project level, so we are looking at a method that is more representative of the entire portfolio that ADB is supporting. So this is what we are trying to do, and Bruce already alluded to about the weakness of the emissions related to the biodiversity, and we are looking how we can make sure that any potential risks are eliminated or minimized as we move forward implementing it. So I'll hand it over to Bruce from here. Bruce.
Okay, thank you very much, VK. Thank you, Noel. So yeah, as you've heard from that, we're looking at the alignment with the Paris Agreement, and there's a methodological approach that's being finalized at the moment for the greenhouse gas accounting portfolio wide. Now, how do we relate that to the safeguards? So firstly, there's going to be a sort of a screening process that will happen for the portfolio. You know, when we consider projects coming to ADB, and we work with our developing member countries as part of the development of country partnership strategies. And this sets the framework for what projects ADB would finance. So the wider approach on portfolio level climate assessment will be linked into that country partnership. So what projects would ADB be financing? And then of course down through to, as we look more details at the concepts and what projects should really come forward into the processing portfolio. So that's the first step, which is part of the climate process. Then once a project comes in, of course, the safeguards will then need to take over and look in more detail. So you would have filtered out projects that wouldn't be aligned with Paris, but then for any projects that still come through, you will need to have further climate assessment at a very specific project level. Now, coming to the biodiversity offsets aspect or biodiversity impacts, currently the policy allows for the mitigation hierarchy with offsets as the option of last resort. Now that is intended under the current framework to ensure that we have no net loss or a net gain of biodiversity. And we know the challenges with offsets, but offsets in that context for biodiversity are not intended to replace carbon as part of a climate offset, carbon offset program. Although, of course, that could be considered as part of an offset program, but in the biodiversity policy, that's not what's considered. So I think we need to be very careful in that space, because we know that the challenges in achieving offsets are quite large. And of course, offsets can take many, many years to achieve the same level of offset. So if you're looking to use, say, the establishment of a forest to offset carbon that has been lost, you could be looking at, maybe 20 to 30 years before you start to approach levels previously. And that may not be appropriate with the timeframes that we have to address climate change issues and meet the Paris targets. So I think we have to be very careful on that and make some separation between how you would go about looking at a sort of a biodiversity offset framework versus a climate one. But, as you hear from the climate change team, this is still a work in progress, and we'll have to work together on that. So, Catherine, that's only a partial response, but, thank you for raising it. It's a really critical issue for us to consider and look at more. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and everyone. Just quickly hand over to Catherine again if she has any additional comments.
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the responses. And, we also understand that this is a work in progress, and that, this is exactly why we have the consultation process. And so I just wanted to perhaps clarify, it's a little bit late on my time, so I'm also not super articulate as well. But I just wanted to clarify that, my question of harmonizing biodiversity and climate commitments was really because, many critical ecosystems and habitats, which are important for biodiversity, are also really important for their climate regulatory value. And so it seemed as if it would be very, very useful for the bank to look at how their climate and biodiversity commitments could be better harmonized and synced up so as to avoid negative impacts, especially in developing countries where much of the world's biodiversity is left. So anyways, thank you so much, and I won't take up any more of your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, indeed, it's a very important topic. We understand the climate change is not a single issue, but it's a multifaceted issue. So we need to take it from different angles, including biodiversity for sure. Okay, let me move over to the next question. Is from Ms. Raselis from the Ateneo of the Manila University. Is mostly related to the relationship within ADB and partnership with local NGOs and local governmental organization. I don't know if Ms. Raselis wants to speak directly. I encourage her to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to turn this, very important framework discussion into what does it mean at local levels where the people are, right? Many of us here in this consultation are really NGOs or faith-based groups working with communities. So we know that communities are affected, they know it themselves, but they're also trying to take steps forward. And so we, as the support NGOs or faith-based groups, are trying to help them by connecting with you, for example, in these framework issues, but also finding out how actually can some of the funding, which is very much needed, and the ideas come so that they are really solidly entrenched in local communities. And let me just add one more thing. I think one of the things we are learning, at least in the Philippines, is that maybe local governments are really the ones who have the biggest stake in solving quite specific problems in their areas. And because they are elected by the people, they are really more accountable or feel accountable and responsive. So what I'm saying is, if you have progressive local governments who want to work with the civil society groups in their municipality or city or rural area, what is your mechanism? I mean, how do we get access to that? Because that is where the action is, and that is where success lies. in communities of active people? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. Please let me over to Noel to answer this.
Thank you. This is a really important question, and let me share with you some of the approaches, and obviously then to move forward. So first of all, we recognize the local level climate actions are key priorities, and we're working through this through different approaches. At the first level, just our investments in social development, such as social protection and livelihoods, to ensure that these projects target the needs of the most vulnerable. A second area where I mentioned in the presentation, but I think maybe just to bring it closer, is the work we're doing on multi-hazard disaster and climate risk analysis. This is to help inform areas of risk, but also future areas of risk as more extreme rainfall, larger floodplains on rivers, sea level rise, etc. So to understand those areas at risk and what resilient investments would look like, and what's the importance of this investment for local communities. We're also working through our governance program to ensure that the country's decentralization process improves meaningful participation of local governments and civil society organizations and vulnerable women and men to participate in climate actions. I also mentioned in the earlier slides, but just to bring it back again, our new program, which is known as the Community Resilience Partnership Program, which is aiming to do the kinds of investments that I've just talked about, but also to do that at a local level, and to ensure that climate policy plans and financing priorities are aimed at the local level and local level solutions. So and this program, I mean, is just being launched, and we are looking at a number of projects across five countries initially to take this forward. And in some, so that's one specific program, but then in other areas, some of our urban planning, our urban investments do also pick up the local level community-based resilience planning. So,
sorry, could you just tell us which 5 countries those are? Because if the people here are in those countries, then maybe we can connect better.
Okay. So 2 of the countries are in the Pacific, which will be Solomon Islands and PNG. That's not finally approved. Or we have Bangladesh, Nepal, and Orgo, if I'm not correct, Indonesia.
Thank you.
But I will put that in the chat, that the absolute confirmation on those.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Noel. I believe Miss Mary hasn't no further question at this point.
No, I think, thank you. That was answered. But if we can focus more of this conversation on that level, because the people here, I'm sure at least half must be working on the ground. So if you could give more attention to those people in the different countries here who are really working on the ground, civil society, since this is a civil society consultation, my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Suggestion is duly noted. I don't know, Bruce, do you want to add anything to what Noel just said?
No, not at this stage. I think Noel's covered very well. Well, perhaps one additional thing. So there's 2 relationships that we're looking at here, at least in part of this consultation, we had the wider ADB climate change program, for example, the resilience program that Noel had just mentioned, which is providing support out to the communities, working with civil society organizations, etc. With the safeguards then coming in down at a specific project level, of course, the community dimensions are absolutely important there as well. And so one aspect that we've discussed in other consultations, and I think, Mary, you've been in some of those as well, is around strengthening the stakeholder participation processes. So when we're looking at project level climate change issues, community risks, vulnerable groups, and bringing that into a community consultation approach as well will be critical. So I'll just add that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Okay, so let's move forward. I'm glad to see there are a number of questions already flowing in. So let's move to Ibu Ninil Jana from Indonesian National Platform on EARD. Ibu Ninil, if you want to give your question directly, you can do in Indonesian. We have a live translation. If not, I go ahead.
No, thank you. I think what I'm writing chat box is sufficient. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question is about the methodology of climate risk assessment and vulnerability risk assessment and the support harmonization or convergence process local level to the national level. Maybe Noel, do you want to start answering this question about methodology?
Yeah. Hi, Francesco. Sorry. So let's just start with the climate risk assessment and the disaster risk assessment. Obviously, our climate risk assessment addresses the climate-related hazards, and our disaster risk assessment has been focusing on the geophysical hazards. Now, we are in the process of updating the methodology. This is being worked on at ADB. We're developing an integrated process, and we recognize the importance of this convergence. As I've mentioned just a few minutes ago, the multi-hazard assessment approach does integrate both climate and disaster risk assessment and the vulnerability assessment. These are an upstream approach to systemic level considerations. But in terms of the new process, we're working to harmonize the project level climate and disaster risk assessment process following the standard definition of risks, which is a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And once established, this harmonized process will be followed for all our projects from national to local levels. So in agreement with the question from Ninil. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Let remain in this more technical aspect of climate change. There are a couple of follow-up questions still from Ibu Ninil, and one is related to the vulnerable groups, and she's suggesting if we can include peoples at high risk of climate or hydrometeorological disaster as a vulnerable group. And then a second follow-up question is related to the high conservation value and high carbon stock approaches of practical methodology for a baseline evaluation and feasibility surveys. Noel, will you want to maybe comment a bit on these two aspects?
Sorry, Francesco, can you just, I'm not seeing that question, so can you just okay. Repeat it, please?
Yes, so the first one is the about the vulnerable group definition, and Ibu Ninil is suggesting to include into definition of vulnerable group, peoples at high risk of climate or hydrometeorological disaster as a vulnerable group in every consultation and project evaluation. And the second one is if does ADB recognize HCV, so high conservation value, and HCS, so high carbon stock approaches, as practical methodologies in baseline or feasibility surveys related to ecosystem services, forest and not forest identification, or perhaps carbon counting.
Okay, let me answer the first part of the question and then check with colleagues. So in terms of this high vulnerability, this is certainly an area that we are considering with all of the assessments. So both the upstream and the project-specific analysis is looking at all of the areas and people, assets impacted by extreme events, but also future risk in relation to increasing incidents of extreme rainfall, sea level rise, etc. So I mean, and things like extreme heat, glacial melts, etc. So I think that is already included in all of the work that we're doing in our climate risk assessment. But on the question of specifying communities that are specific, that are particularly vulnerable, I'm not quite sure if this specifically relates to the new wording of the safeguard policy, but in terms of a process that we are currently undertaking, this is certainly part of the process. Then in terms of the high conservation value, Francisco, this is something I'm going to have to go over to the environment team on. I think is Bruce is a team. Can I hand over to you, Bruce?
Thanks, Noel. We may go to Duncan Lang, who's our lead for the biodiversity standard on this one. Duncan, are you able to come in? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the question. So on the HCV assessment, I actually did some training on this a number of years back with WWF, so I'm aware of how to do it. So what we already have within our policies, we have this critical habitat analysis, which is pretty similar actually to what we would do for HCV assessment. So when we do a project, we do that level of consideration when we're doing the baseline assessment. What we don't probably do is the carbon stock assessment, but moving forward, one of the things that we've recognized that we're not doing particularly well at ADB is this ecosystem services assessment. And I think this is something that we can kind of try and build into that process. The thing that we're trying to sort of wrap our head around at the moment is when we trigger the requirement to do full detailed ecosystem assessments, ecosystem services assessments, sorry, versus when we don't need to do them. So that bit is something that we're trying to work out. But we also have, we've got an expert, a guy called Kelvin Pei, who built the Tessa tool, and he's looking to help us with that work. And hopefully we will, when we do get the policy update later down the line, we'll have some tools that will be available to go with the policy that is updated. But any feedback from yourself about, when you think we should bring in these tools to do this ecosystem services assessment, particularly as we're talking today about climate and carbon stocks, would be very helpful feedback for us as we can, pass that on to him as we're doing that. But maybe just to summarize, HCV, we already kind of do with the critical habitat work, and the carbon stock assessment, probably not, but that's something I think we need to do better. So feedback from you about how we could do that would be very helpful. Thanks, that's it for me. Over, maybe Ninil, you might want to respond. Thank you.
Mohon maaf bahasa Indonesia. Barangkali mungkin HCS bisa dipertimbangkan karena setiap negara itu memiliki mungkin tidak menggunakan definisi atau punya definisi yang berbeda terhadap apa itu primary forest. Indonesia nggak kenal outdoor forest misalnya. Jadi dan HCS menurut saya adalah pendekatan yang sekarang paling tidak banyak orang sudah tahu dan mungkin bisa diadopsi untuk membantu beberapa negara atau mungkin daerah untuk mengidentifikasi forest dan non forest sehingga ketika kita bicara ini itu bagian dari climate, mungkin juga bagian dari environmental safeguard. Saya kira itu ADB mungkin bisa mempertimbangkan. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Ibu Ninil. I think another aspect we can consider is integrated more remote sensing in this case, in order also to identify high carbon storage areas. For example, I believe there are few techniques already available, and we have a strong collaboration with the European Space Agency, for example, which is helping us in mapping mangroves in some area of the Pacific and in the Pacific as well. So I think it's something we can definitely extend more. I don't know, Duncan, if you want to say something to close.
No, only that thank you for the feedback, and definitely we'll take that on board, and we'll certainly look to expand what we have in the existing policy. And the ecosystem services, I think we can safely say, something that we've not really done particularly great job at in terms of our assessment under the existing policy, and it's something we certainly need to improve on. So yeah, if anybody has feedback on how we could do that better, we would definitely welcome that feedback and try and integrate it into our thinking. And ecosystem services is of course very cross-cutting, so this covers a lot of things. Climate change is one of them, but it's also community health and safety, as well as many other things, so and indigenous people. So we would very much welcome feedback. That's it for me. Thanks, Fran. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Bruce, over to you.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I wanted to firstly appreciate the comments and come back to the issue on vulnerability. For the safeguards, we are currently working on further clarification on the definitions of vulnerable individuals and groups in the context of the safeguard policy. That's obviously very critical for the assessment process, but also for meaningful stakeholder engagement and consultation processes throughout project level safeguards and project design. So that is one key area that links to other parts of the policy. And then in relation to the high conservation value and carbon stock assessments, it's a really excellent point. It's one I think we'll need to take back with the team in terms of other options. Is it necessary to link this also to, say, critical habitat assessments? This relates to some of the questions and comments that Catherine Luth from Friends of the Earth mentioned later. So it's clearly linked. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Yes, so let's move ahead. As we are seeing, the climate change issues are really cross-cutting issues. So we talk about biodiversity, we talk about carbon stock. Another very important thing that we should consider is our land rights. So the next question comes from Nathaniel Don Marquez. Maybe it's a pretty long question. So if you don't mind, can you maybe do it online, or prefer me to read it on the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's really not a question, but a feedback on the ADB's strategy on addressing climate change. And in summary, what we're saying is that in our region, sorry, I have difficulty. I'm on travel, so the video connection is not good. Okay, going back, what I'm saying is that we're talking about the Asian context. Poverty is still rural, and that the poor people are often let out of the climate change discussions, especially those without land or near landless. And they are the one actually who are more affected and vulnerable to climate change. And therefore, unfortunately, there's a lack of understanding on the link of land rights, climate change, disasters. On this note, our organization has undertaken a regional study to look into this matter. And I have shared to the Secretariat that publication, that study, and hopefully that will be disseminated to the participants. But just to highlight 4 major recommendations from that study. First is we need to humanize climate change discussions, where climate change discussions focus on its physical impacts. We should also focus on climate change as an issue of humanity in terms of lifestyle, consumption behaviors, and inequalities. Second, government should undertake a review of major national laws on climate change and natural disasters, on whether they explicitly address the links between climate change and disasters and tenure rights. Government should adopt a framework that ensures the protection of tenure rights in the face of natural and man-made disaster. Third, while many governments include agriculture as a priority for adaptation within their nationally determined contributions, very few address issues of tenure security and land governance. Government thus should include clear commitments that recognize and strengthen tenure of vulnerable communities in their NDCs and national adaptation plans. Finally, for longer-term climate change adaptation and disaster preparedness, comprehensive land use planning at the local level should be guided by scientific hazard mapping studies, a national policy on land use, and a policy on ensuring land tenure security for those likely to be affected by the land use plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very clear and a very important topic to be discussed. Maybe as a very first comment, I can pass it to Bruce on a general question about the land tenure and climate risks.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel, and thank you also for sharing the paper on tenure security and climate change issues. Obviously very important, both at a broader level as we seek to address climate change issues on people and communities, but also for the safeguards, because of course we do look at issues around resettlement with projects. We have Indigenous people's rights issues also in the safeguard policy. So, clearly needs to be considered as part of that framework. I'd like to check though if my colleagues from the climate change team, perhaps Noel or Virgo Singer-Roy, may like to speak on the wider issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. I mean, and we'd like to thank Nathaniel for highlighting the issues related to land. We recognize that climate adaptation actions should address the relevant underlying drivers of vulnerability, including the question of land, productive assets, gender norms, etc. And this should be part of the vulnerability assessment process to inform the climate adaptation actions. So in agreement with the points he's raised, and just in terms of the last point in the principles that he raised on the long-term comprehensive land use planning, I mean, this is the part of the work that we are aiming to achieve with the kind of multi-hazard climate and disaster risk assessment that I mentioned earlier, which are then informing spatial planning processes or various approaches to managing adaptation for the long term. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel and Bruce. Hand it back to Nathaniel if he wants to add further comments.
No, we're open to further discussing with ADB regarding this initiative. And as I said, I've already provided the study, and we look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We received the study, and for sure we'll get in touch with you. So let's move to a couple of anonymous questions that been sent to us. They are related to another pretty important topic, which is the industrial livestock use. And one of the question is if we plan to expand the prohibited investment activity list to include unsustainable industrial livestock system, which can harm both people, animal, and the planet. So they would be consistent with the IPCC report, which call for transformative actions across different systems, including food systems. So the question is how ADB is looking at intensively livestock in the context of safeguard, and how much of food system impact on climate change will be recognized within operation and decision regarding safeguards. Maybe Bruce, do you want to take this?
So just very briefly, and I may turn over to Noel O'Brien and team. So this issue relates also to ADB's strategy for food security, rural development, and agriculture. So I'm not in a position to necessarily comment outright in terms of whether or not that should be part of the safeguards framework. I think it's an issue that needs to be looked at in relation to climate change, but also the agricultural sector. An important issue, of course, very critical that we align towards sustainable agricultural practices that are, low carbon and aligned with the Paris Agreement. I think that's very critical for ADB strategic operations. And the consideration also of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that would need to come into the sectoral guidelines for ADB's alignment with the Paris Agreement. But Noel, would you like to add more on that?
Just getting my, can you hear me again? Yes. So I think, Bruce, just to add to what you've already indicated, our commitment to fully align with the Paris Agreement by 2023 for our sovereign operations and non-sovereign operations by 2025. We will be looking specifically at all of the types of investments in the agricultural sector that ADB supports, and ensuring that those are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in terms of questions of specific exclusions, those are still under development as part of the process going forward. Back to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Noel. So yeah, I think one thing that the safeguards can consider there is we do have the prohibited investments list, but the consideration first in terms of the agricultural sector and climate change needs to be worked through. Then if appropriate, we can look in the context of the prohibited investments list.
Sorry, Bruce, maybe one point that I should have also brought up, and as part of that is, our work that I also mentioned in the presentation is this work on the nationally determined contributions. So where we're working on going into more details on what those particular sector NDCs mean for countries. So working in close collaboration with the government to determine much more detailed sector plans, and also to the kind of investment pipelines that will enable governments to achieve their specific commitments per sector in the NDC. So I think that's also an important part of this work. Back to you.
Thank you, Noel. I think that's covered well. So I'll pass back to you, Francesca.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce and Noel. I think I covered both the anonymous comments sent to us related to GHG emission of livestock. I want to maintain a bit of flow of question moving on another technical question related to the GHG cap. So Yobel Putra is asking, why does ADB only adopt the annual cap of 100,000 CO2 equivalent per year? What make such figures determined as low carbon or Paris aligned? Noel?
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. You want to ask directly? Please go ahead.
Yeah. So it's more on what makes such investment green or considered climate resilient and Paris aligned, or in the new energy policy low carbon. Because it's kind of frustrating to know that the statement of low carbon has been there in the new energy policy, but the safeguard hasn't have a structure to classify what makes it green. And there's also some investment classified as green bonds, climate bonds, but we don't really know what makes it really green. So the general question here is, what makes such investment green, climate resilient, or Paris aligned? Would ADB consider, what are the consideration of measures that will be used by ADB to make such justification? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. Noel, would you mind maybe to come in? Noel,
Sorry,
okay.
My mute, yes. So I was just going to ask VK to come in with the start of this question. VK, you're here. Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, thanks, Noel. A bit of a clarification. This is a fantastic question, and a bit of a clarification. And I would seek confirmation from the safeguards team, Zera, in specific. The 100,000 tons of CO2 is not meant to be a cap. It is the threshold of 100,000 tons of absolute emissions that are going to be reported. Zera, am I right?
I can just comment on that, VK. That's right. It's a significant threshold which was intended under the 2009 policy, so more than a decade old, to determine projects that needed more detailed climate change assessment and monitoring throughout the life of the project.
Yes. So continuing on that, so it is not the cap. It is any project which is going to emit more than 100,000 tons of absolute emissions are going to be reported. So that makes it very consistent with our intent to make our operations Paris aligned, as Noel mentioned earlier. In addition to that, what I mentioned, that the ADB is quite committed to do the GHG accounting of its entire project portfolio, for which we are developing guidelines. So we had different options. We could do the assessment of the absolute emissions and report, but that does not represent the entire portfolio, especially in the context of ADB's 2030 strategy, which Noel introduced, that we are looking at 75% of operations supporting climate change. At the same time, if we were to report our only the emission reductions of the portfolio, that would also not be entirely representative of the portfolio. So the approach that we are taking is to come with the relative emissions. Relative emissions will be assessed at the project level and then consolidated at the portfolio level. And for which, as I mentioned earlier, we are looking at any project which is emitting in excess of 25K of 20K of emissions, either emissions or emission reductions. That is very, very, very low threshold level. So our intent is to widen the net of our GHG accounting, be it emission reductions, be it the absolute emissions, which the balance of the two would be reflected by way of coming with the relative emission at the project level and then consolidated at the portfolio level, which is going to be disclosed by the bank. So I think this is going to be quite consistent with our approach to make our operations Paris aligned and make it very, very transparent in terms of the carbon footprint of our individual projects and at the portfolio level as well. I'll stop here. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you very much, VK. Let me hand over to you, Bel, for any additional comments.
Yeah, I've put on the chat. I just want to raise that the EU has the listed waste to energy incinerator because it's high carbon emission. They have some threshold to justify what is low carbon and what's not. And that makes the incinerator has been listed from the EU Sustainable Taxonomy Finance. And it's just questionable for me why ADB claim that such project for waste to energy in many countries are classified as blue bonds, green bonds, and low carbon in the new energy policy. That's my additional comment. Thank you.
Francesco, maybe I can come in, not specific on the waste to energy question, but a little bit more detail on how the Paris alignment process will look at some of these questions. So in terms of each project for screening, I mean, we have, there will be the lists of aligned projects. There will be those that are not aligned, and then there will be an area, gray area, which will obviously need much more in detail consideration. But the areas is one is aspects that we will consider is the consistency with the country's NDCs, also consistent with the country's climate change strategy, looking at sector-specific low greenhouse gas emission development pathways, conformity with those pathways, and specific features that will look at lock-in or support in relation to other fossil fuel dependence. So in terms of the kinds of, for each of the sectors, we will be looking at those investments that are universally aligned. So for example, in the energy sector, investments in anything relating to renewable energy from solar, wind, wave power, or geothermal, and which have negligible greenhouse gas emissions for their life cycle, would be considered universally aligned. Then in terms of other sectors such as water supply systems, water quality improvement, water efficiency, in terms of transport, electric non-motorized transport would be universally aligned. Then in relation to examples of what would be the non-aligned, if we look at obviously thermal coal, electric power generation from coal, extraction of peat, and electricity from peat are all non-aligned. Now, in terms of then we have the overlapping area, which will require specific consideration for each investment in a country-specific context. So, for example, in some areas where the investment may be a transition away from coal, and it may be a transition process, will also need to be considered. Back to you, Francesco.
Yes, thank you very much, Noel. This is, of course, a very large discussion that we could have. But since we are really going a bit short of time, we have about 15 minutes left for this consultation. Please let me move forward to the next question. And thank you, Yobel, again for your question. We look forward to continue discussion with you. So the next question is again a technical one. Is it related to? Let me go back to the question. Sorry, I've lost it. The method or disaster risk analysis. Pak Untung Tri Winarso, if you are still there, do you want to make your question live? So maybe you can explain better what are you asking about the methodology? Pak Winarso, are you there?
Ya, ada.
Thanks, please go ahead.
Ya, terima kasih. Saya pakai bahasa Indonesia ya. Ya, jadi apakah IDB dalam proses metodologi kajian risiko bencana dan perubahan iklim, bagaimana metodenya dan bagaimana mengadopsi tentang kajian risiko bencana yang untuk di Indonesia, konteks Indonesia sudah menjadi standar pelayanan minimal bagi kabupaten kota. Dan ada rencana aksi daerah penurunan emisi gas rumah kaca atau GRK di setiap provinsi dan kabupaten. Nah, bagaimana proses melakukan kajian risiko bencana tersebut pada proyek-proyek pemerintah maupun private sector ketika bagaimana mengadopsi atau melakukan rujukan terhadap kajian risiko bencana dan kajian risiko iklim yang sudah dimiliki oleh kabupaten, kota, dan daerah yang sudah menjadi kewajiban bagi proyek-proyek yang akan berjalan maupun yang sudah ongoing proses yang sudah berjalan, terutama untuk private sector. Karena undang-undang terbaru di Indonesia dengan lahirnya Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja, bagi private sector, kajian risiko, analisis risiko, dan analisis mengenai dampak lingkungan atau AMDAL, itu tidak diwajibkan lagi bagi perusahaan-perusahaan yang skalanya kecil maupun sedang. Analisis risiko dan AMDAL itu hanya diwajibkan untuk perusahaan yang skalanya besar. Gitu. Nah, yang pertama, kalau misalnya bisa nggak dimasukkan dalam safeguard ini, proses merujuk kepada kajian risiko bencana dan kajian iklim yang sudah ada di kabupaten kota dan mendorong bagi kabupaten kota yang belum memiliki kajian-kajian tersebut. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Pak Winarso. Let me hand over to the climate team, please, to answer this pretty technical question.
Sorry, Francesco, do you have, can you just reiterate the question to me, please?
Yeah, it was pretty long. So is a question about how to integrate.
Bagaimana proses melakukan kajian risiko bencana dan iklim pada proyek yang akan berjalan dan yang sedang berjalan ketika yang pertama, kalau konteks di Indonesia, mungkin bisa menjadi contoh, kajian risiko bencana dan RAD untuk rencana aksi daerah untuk penurunan gas rumah kaca, itu telah menjadi mandatori bagi kabupaten kota. Nah, itu bagaimana mengadopsi kajian risiko bencana yang telah ada dan bagaimana mendorong kabupaten kota yang belum memiliki kajian risiko bencana tersebut. Karena sekarang ini dengan adanya Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja, kalau di Indonesia tidak menjadi mandatori lagi bagi perusahaan atau proyek-proyek yang skalanya kecil dan sedang, tetapi menjadi mandatori hanya untuk proyek-proyek atau perusahaan-perusahaan yang akan menjalankan proyek yang skalanya besar. Jadi bagaimana melakukan adaptasi di regulasi-regulasi yang ada di suatu negara. Begitu.
Yeah, thanks. In the interest of time, it's just that I couldn't see the translation. So sorry, I'm gonna, of the question. So I'm gonna ask Orgo to come in with it. He's put his hand up. Orgo, please.
Sure, thank you, Noel, and thank you, Pa, for your question. Very, very important question, and also thanks for sharing the Indonesia's experience on this topic. In ADB, at a project level, every single project is mandated to do a climate risk screening and assessment, as mentioned by Noel. earlier, and this includes both public sector projects as well as private sector projects. And if those projects are found to be at a high, medium or high climate risk, then they have to show that they have integrated adaptation and resilience measures in the project design. And the final project document that goes to board discloses both the climate risk status as well as what measures have been undertaken. The system has been in place for many years. It's been improved over the years also. However, we do find challenges, as you mentioned, in the private sector case, because unlike in public sector, where we have a long time to support the government in project preparation, in private sector cases, sometimes a project often comes with us with always, some ideas already defined very much. But we are working with the private sector colleagues to see how we can work with our client private sector companies to build their capacity on how they can do these assessments more efficiently. And as Noel mentioned, in the new tool that we are developing, we are trying to harmonize this climate risk assessment and disaster risk assessment together for both public sector as well as private sectors. Hopefully moving forward, we'll be able to further improve our existing processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, Papa Winarso, do you want to come back? Do you have an additional comments or questions? Okay, I can't hear from Papa Winarso now, so I guess we can move forward. So we have about 5 minutes left for this Q&A question. So if you have any remaining comments or questions, please feel free to drop in the chat box or raise your hand so that we can finish this session with additional question. I think I'm checking my list. We have another question, I think, but was not strictly related on climate change. Is from Mr. Chanrot Ra from Cambodia. If it's related to if there are any complaint mechanisms from CSOs related to safeguard compliance, and what are the procedures to, I guess, to file a complaint. I can quickly answer that. I think that we have, for each project, we have the possibility for anyone involved to comment and to file complaint. Any project has a specific grievance mechanism that you are supposed to find in the environmental impact assessment and the social impact assessment as well. Or you can, of course, write directly to us if you have any concern related to that. Again, if we don't have any other question, we have, I think we can touch on probably the last one, and is related to gender and climate change. So a question from Saira Taidar. Are you still there? Do you want to ask your question to our experts?
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Fine. So my question was that what the ADB climate policy, how they address the impact on gender, and how we can integrate or entertain different gender aspects in the climate change policy and in the climate adaptation program. I wrote in the chat box. I can't access in detail. I have written there. Can you see my question from there?
Yes, we can see that. Yes. Okay, thank you very much for your question. I think it's also an important angle to be considered. Gender and climate change.
Yes.
Yeah. Any of my colleagues want to comment on this? Noel, Bruce?
Sure, Francesco, I can start. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the question in the chat, but I think obviously there's always two aspects here in how we look at. Obviously, we've talked quite a bit about the fact that we look at the climate risk and associated with each of our investments. So this is the asset or specific investment level that we conduct climate risk assessments, looking at the hazard, the vulnerability, the exposure, to understand the comprehensive risk. And as part of that, we will have our consultations, data gathering, etc., and we will apply gender considerations to that process. Likewise, at the larger upstream multi-hazard assessment, gender considerations are part of that process. Then if we look to the second aspect where ADBs is investing in climate-related investments. Here, ADB's gender policy will be applied to all of our climate investments in the same way that it is being applied to all of ADB's investments. So I hope that clarifies for you. Thank you.
Actually, yes, my concern was that in different climate changes are affecting different gender in multiple ways, particularly in those countries which are very vulnerable to climate changes. So how in the climate change program we are going to protect or we are going to entertain that all genders are entertained in the same way? Like they are very vulnerable, particularly female and like children, to the climate changes. So how we are going to address that they are protected in a proper way?
So as part of the climate risk and vulnerability assessments, we do give consideration to how women, children will be impacted as part of our assessments. So as I've indicated, so in relation to specific investments, so if it is the road or an energy related investment where we're considering the climate related risks of that, we will apply gender considerations. But then where we do more upstream analysis to look at larger areas such as a city as a whole, or to look at a small island or a particular watershed, we do apply, we look at the impact on the gender as part of that process. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Sarah, for your question. Very, very relevant one. I'll just mention two things. Firstly, the safeguard policy also looks at gender differentiated risks. So where we see specific risks to women, to girls, to men, we need to consider those differentiated risks and bring that into the assessment process and also into the consultation process. The second part, though, is we're looking to see how that can and should be strengthened in the revised safeguard policy. And we will actually be undertaking some further consultations on this topic. Actually, starting next week, the first consultation will be on the 24th of May. We'll be looking more broadly at gender and safeguards. Then the following week, from the 30th of May, we'll be having a consultation on gender and related issues on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. And then the following week, on the 6th of June, we'll be looking at sexual orientation and gender identity issues. So we're taking a sort of comprehensive look at gender issues. And of course, it needs to be integrated across the various different aspects that our safeguards considers. So we can follow up more in those next consultations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, that's really wonderful to know that we have separate sessions for each of the thematic areas for gender. So thank you so much for informing, and I would like to join those consultations to learn more about this topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me wrap up this this session. It's been a very interesting one with a lot of different topics coming from land issues to, of course, climate, energy, biodiversity, gender, disaster risk reduction. So it has been a very comprehensive, and thank you very much, everyone, for your question and your participation. So let me please hand over to Azim for the the closure of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Bruce, Sarah, Noel, Argia, Madhu, Patty, Peter, as well as anyone else I've unintentionally missed, and others, including those from the events management and SEP teams working tirelessly behind the scenes. Thank you all, but of course, a special and huge thanks to all of you, our participants and informants, for raising the questions and issues that you have, for the sharing of experiences and the constructive feedback. I want to reiterate that the comments on the study on climate change that are received from this consultation will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB's standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go just yet. On your screen, please give us your feedback, and you will see a poll question coming up. The question is, how would you rate your satisfaction with today's session on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most satisfied to 1 being the least satisfied? Just give us your impulsive and gut reaction on how you felt this engagement and consultation went, ranking the consultation on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest mark, 1 being the lowest mark. And we can quickly read out the results of that poll in the next 10 to 15 seconds. So your responses quickly would be gratefully appreciated. And then a reminder to go to the mentee poll that is also on your screen. If you go to the chat, you can see the link for the mentee poll. And this asks, what specific opportunities have been missed or what can be improved in these consultations to encourage better engagement, encourage better consultation, encourage more meaningful dialogue. If you have 3 or 4 or even 5 sentences on how you can, on the ideas you may have that could help us to improve the levels of consultations, we'd be very, very grateful for those. So with that, I'm not sure if we're finished with the Zoom poll, but maybe we could have the results of the Zoom poll now and read those back to you. So we see that approximately 80% have said either somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied, and the remaining 20-ish percentage are saying either neutral or somewhat dissatisfied. So these consultations aren't perfect, and the opportunity for you to provide feedback on how to improve them occurs through the mentee poll. So with the mentee poll, please click on the link and let us know how these consultations can be improved so that further consultations will be better and can respond to your needs and desires and take maximum advantage of the opportunities being presented. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn to offer us a glimpse of what lies ahead, number 1, and number 2, to provide us a summary of what we've heard in today's first climate change consultation. Over to you, Bruce.
Well, thank you very much, Azim, and thank you so much to everyone that's joined today. A really interesting session and some really great, really important points that have been raised. A lot of issues, and we have gone over time, so I'll try to be brief in just covering a few key summary points at the end here. Firstly, we had quite a bit of discussion around greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the linkage of how ADB will assess greenhouse gas emissions as part of our commitment to align with the Paris Agreement. So we had some points from our climate change team in particular about that Paris alignment process, the development of methodology, how that will apply also to the entire portfolio, and also noting the need to look at specific sectoral guidance and alignment also with the work of other international financial institutions on greenhouse gas accounting. So that is a process that is currently ongoing, and we're seeking to have the methodologies further developed this year. The Paris alignment, excuse me, will come into place for our sovereign operations 100% by July 2023 and 85% for our non-sovereign operations. So we need to have that in place prior to that operational date of July 2023. Linked to that, there was questions around what makes a investment aligned, Paris aligned, and Noel's spoken more about this in terms of looking at lists of aligned and non-aligned projects, but also recognizing that there are some grey areas that need further consideration. Also the need to look at the consistency of the investment support and alignment with the nationally determined contributions and other country climate change action plans and their conformity with low carbon development pathways. Next, we had some questions about the current greenhouse gas significance threshold for monitoring and reporting that is included in the safeguard policy statement. It's currently set at 100,000 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. That was the threshold in the 2009 policy. That's being reviewed now, as you heard in the assessments, but we also heard from VK Dougal from the climate change team that the threshold in the assessment of emissions as well as emissions reductions across ADB as a whole is now being considered at 20,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, so coming down from that 100,000 tons earlier. Some good questions also on the relationships between climate change and biodiversity, and important recommendation on the need to harmonize. Habitats are obviously very important for carbon storage and climate change, as well as for biodiversity. So we need to look carefully at that. There were linked points also about high conservation value assessment and carbon stock assessments. So this is something that we'll consider further in the coming months. Critical point also raised earlier on in the consultation was about communities, the need for funding for local communities in working with them to support and solve climate change issues, as well as, of course, with local governments, and an important recommendation for their participation and to consider the needs of the most vulnerable. Next, quite a bit of discussion around the methodology for climate and disaster risk assessment. As you heard from ADB, there is already an existing process for climate risk assessment for all projects, and that all projects with medium and high risks need to be considered for further adaptation and resilience measures at the project level. Methodology has been strengthened over time and is still under review, and we need to consider how this appropriately links to the safeguards. And you'll recall in Zara Abbas's presentation that we need to look at not just the impact of climate change on the project or the project area, but also the relationship between a project and how that would impact. Next, we had some questions about the relationships between climate change and land tenure issues, and grateful also for the submission of a report for us to consider on that. Next, there was some issues around other areas for possible consideration in terms of exclusion or the management of climate change risks more intensively, mention of industrial livestock, and then incineration. But that's a very brief summary of many of the issues covered today. Of course, there's more details, which we will be capturing in a summary of this event and then channeling into further consideration. Just want to note also that at the moment, we're considering carefully where climate change will sit in the new policy. Is it integrated in the environmental and social assessment process and other standards, or is there a need for a separate climate change standard? That's an issue that's still being considered. Now, moving forward, as I've mentioned, we do have other consultations. This week, we've got a series of consultations still on climate change. We'll be covering civil society organizations in other regions, and then also our developing member countries. And then you can refer to our website for a range of other topics that are coming up, including the ones on gender that I mentioned, but also in June, we'll have sessions on financial modalities for ADB and how the safeguards apply to them, including the private sector. So please do stay tuned. There are more discussions in these regional consultations coming up, and they are feeding into the development of the policy itself. And we're working at this stage towards having a draft policy available for further consultation with stakeholders, including civil society, by about September this year. And that will be kept under review, and we'll keep you informed of that. So again, thank you very much for joining today. Really appreciated it. And until we meet with the next consultations, please take care. Thank you.